Hey everyone, this is Hermina here, and today I thought I'd bring you a deck profile of my Coming Beauty Hermina, or the powerful deck, Post-LBT-03. So if you've seen my Medieval deck profile, you know that I mentioned that that deck is very much like a watered down Great Nature from V kind of deck. Going along that line, I would say that Hermina is actually kind of a Nova Grappler style deck, where you're multi-attacking and just blowing through your resources as quickly as you can. But despite that, this deck after LBT-03 is actually pretty half decent. It can do some pretty nutty things. So let's go ahead and go over it. Right, so let's go ahead and get started with the ride line. So we are playing Hermina's ride line. You can choose whatever starter you want. It's generic D starter. And then we have the grade 1. So the grade 1 actually has 2 skills. The first is an axe. So on either van or rear, once per turn, you can Soul Blast 1, discard a card from your hand, and then you get to draw a card. So that Soul Blast and discard is, the effect's not the greatest. It really kind of sucks that it is discard first and then draw, because you sometimes have like a lot of good combo pieces in your hand that you want to keep, and just discarding one to dig a little bit deeper is not the greatest. But you do really need this card, and you do need to proc the first skill when you ride it, just because you do need to empty out the soul for its second skill, which is powerful. Powerful is a keyword that activates when your soul has no cards in it. So obviously if you ride into this and then you Soul Blast your starter, you discard and draw the card, your soul is going to be empty, so that next turn when you would ride, you can actually ride the grade 2 without discarding a card from your hand. So you do get a little bit of advantage from the fact that you don't have to discard from ride deck in this deck, but it definitely helps a little bit. So next up, the grade 2. The grade 2 doesn't really do anything. It gets 2k whenever it swings, either on van or rear, which sometimes makes magic numbers if you have like an 8k booster behind it and you're swinging at a grade 2 Vanguard. But its other skill is basically the same skill as the grade 1, where if you have no cards in soul, you can ride without discarding. Now, getting the grade 1 out of soul is a little bit tricky in this deck. That you do kind of want to mulligan for something that can help you empty out your soul in order to do that, because you really don't want to be discarding in this deck, because as I said, everything is a combo piece and you need to keep them in your hand in order to actually use them, obviously. Alright, and so with that, we're gonna go over the main card of the deck, which is Coming Beauty Hermina. She has an act once per turn, counterblast 1 and give her 5k. So that's not a once per turn, so you can actually use as many counterblasts as you want and pump her up for 5k every single time. You might think that sounds really bad, but honestly, this the first skill is there just for versatility, to combo with her second skill. Her second skill is powerful, so if you have no cards in your soul, at the end of the battle that she attacked, if you have no cards in your soul and you have no face-up cards in your damage zone, which is where the first skill comes, because sometimes you have too much damage, you can discard a card. You choose one of your rear guards that has a powerful ability, and you stand it. Also, you reduce the next time you would counterblast by 1. So that doesn't mean that you can counterblast for free. It just reduces the cost by 1. Most of the time, that's going to mean that you are playing it for free, but there is one card that you still need to counterblast 1 more to use its skill, because it's a counterblast 2 and reduced by 1 makes it counterblast 1. So basically this deck is a 4-attack deck, and you're swinging for pretty big numbers, especially if you're on a Persona ride, and it honestly just scales pretty well, especially with some of the new support we got, and just like yeah. Alright, so that's going to do it for the ride deck. Alright, so moving on to the main deck, we are playing the other 3 copies of Hermina in the main deck, because we do want to have Persona Ride. When you Persona Ride, you can actually get some really insane numbers, like we're talking 40s and 30s, just by doing what your deck does. The one issue with Persona Riding in this deck, I will say, is that you get a card in the soul when you Persona Ride. So if you are Persona Ride, you need to make sure that you have a card in your hand that lets you get things out of your soul. Thankfully, one of the new cards from LBT-03 really immensely helps with this and makes it so easy to basically achieve that powerful condition. Alright, so next up we have 4 copies of Teruis. So Teruis is a grade 3 and she has 1 skill. She has powerful, so if your card has no souls, when she attacks you can counterblast 1. She gets a skill that when her attack hits, you get to draw a card until the end of that battle. So if you swing, use her skill, hit, draw a card. If you restand her and swing again, she will not gain that skill to draw a card on hit unless you counterblast 1. Which with Hermina, you can make that skill free. And then in addition to that, she also gives another unit 5k. So what you normally would do for this, with this card, is you would swing boosted. You would give power to the booster. That way you make a better number. And then restand her and boost with her again because we have a restanding boosting rear guard. And then that just scales it scales pretty well. Alright, so moving on to the grade 2s, we have the 4 copies of Nala. So Nala is actually a very important card in this deck, mostly because, as I said before, you really need to be emptying out your soul, and the hardest way to empty out your soul is on when you ride into the grade 2 and you need to get the grade 1 out. So this card really helps with it. It's one of the better cards to empty out your soul with, because you actually get advantage. So this has a skill where when it's placed on rear guard during the main phase, you counterblast 1, you choose a card from your soul, and call it out to an open rearguard circle. Then, if you have any other cards in your soul, you choose 1 card from your hand for every card in your soul, and you discard it. So most of the time that you're not going to have to discard anything, because you're only going to be having 1 card in the soul. So you just call this, counterblast 1, call out usually your grade 1, or sometimes you call out your grade 2 if you need it. So this card, not only is it +1, it also helps you empty out the soul, which is something that you definitely need in this deck. And then it does have a second skill, which is pretty good, which is powerful if you have no cards in your soul. When this card attacks a grade 3 or greater Vanguard. So it's kind of unfortunate that this can't work when you're going first, because you actually do have a pretty strong push turn on your first grade 3 turn, regardless of whether your opponent's on grade 3 or not. So it kind of sucks that it doesn't work, but it's fine. It basically gets 5k until the end of turn, so it's always going to be hitting. It's swinging for 15. And do note that this card is worded the same way as Alden from Bastion, where every single time it swings, it gets 5k. So you're swinging first 15, and then if you restand it, you're swinging 20, which with an 8k boost is a pretty good number. So the next card we're going to talk about is a really good card that we got from LBT-03, which really just ups the deck's ceiling so much. This is going to be the 4 copies of Riley. So she has 2 skills. The first skill is an act. Once per turn, you can Soul Blast 1, choose your Vanguard, and it gets 5k until end of turn. So you might think that's okay, whatever, an extra power, who cares? But actually the important part is that you're Soul Blasting. So this card actually helps you get that last little soul that you need out from under your Vanguard, whether you Persona Ride or whether it's your first grade 3 turn. Getting that soul out is just so important, and having another card that actually does that, and not only does that but actually makes it good, because you're pumping up your Vanguard to 18, which is a really good magic number, because it means that they can't call a trigger and 2 to pass you. So it comes up so much more than you think. But that's not the main reason she's good. The main reason she's good is because she has a powerful ability, which means she can be restood. And when she attacks a Vanguard, if you're in powerful, Counterblast 2, this unit gets plus 10k until the end of turn. So note that if she restands, she keeps the 10k. And then, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Hermina in its name, so if you're on grade 3, not your opponent, this unit gets to perform drive checks. So, moving on with the... continuing with the Bastion analogies, this deck actually does have I think his name is Ragrail. So she doesn't get Twin Drive, but she just has a single drive because she is a grade 2. This skill is just like really good. You might think Counterblast 2, that's really expensive. Actually, it's really not for this deck, because especially in LBT-03, when this deck first came out, a lot of the issues with the deck is that you had problems turning your damage face down. You didn't have enough things to counterblast, and you would end up having to blow through all your counterblast using Hermina's skill to just pump it up. This gives you something to put all that counterblast into, and something that's really good because it's a +1 because you're getting a drive check, and you're also increasing your chances of hitting triggers. So this card is just really good. You might think, oh, you can only use it once because you're counterblasting 2. How are you going to use it more than once? So in order to use this card, you do actually need like 2 counterblast open, because what you can do is you swing with this the first time, counterblast 2, perform your drive checks, you swing with Hermina, and then you restand this. Now you're going to have 0 face-up damage because the only way you can restand is if you have no face-up damage. Now there's a countercharger that activates after the Vanguard swings. So after you do that, you countercharge 1 and reduce her cost by 1 counterblast. So now you have 1 face-up damage, and you're swinging with her again. So you swing, and now her skill is counterblast 1. So you counterblast the card you just countercharged, and then she performs drive checks, and she gets another 10k. So she's swinging 20 or 30 on a Persona ride, and then she's standing, and she's swinging 40 with a drive check. So this card can just like insanely get out of control. So it's just like such a good card. This is what the deck really needed back in LBT-04 or LBT-01, excuse me. Alright, so for our last grade 2, this is just going to be a little bit of a flex slot. This is a common from LBT-03. Her name's Agria. She's basically just a 15k attacker when you have no cards in the soul. So this, as I said, this is pretty much a flex slot. You can choose whatever you want in here. I was playing the grade 3 that countercharges and protects your board. I didn't find it very useful. So I decided just like having a 15k attacker is probably going to make better numbers because you're boosting with 18 and that's 23, which is a nice number. So I just like this for now. You could realistically try whatever you'd like. Hermina has a 10k shield. You could play the 30k Blitz Order shield. But I'm finding this to be fine. I would say there's options like Melty, but you honestly want to use your Counterblast more for your skills. And there's also things like Beware of Overeating or Yukia. I don't think those cards are really good for this deck, just because they kind of conflict with a lot of the things you're trying to do in the deck. And you really have specific boosters that you really want to be playing in this deck, and you want them to be boosting your rear guards or at least one column. Alright, so moving on to the grade 1s for the deck. We're going to be starting off with the 4 copies of Signy. So now this card really is the MVP of the deck. It really carries it on its back. Even when this deck first came out, it really did. So let's go over it. So its first skill is Powerful. When it boosts, if you're in Powerful, you Counterblast 1, choose one of your units, and it gets 5k until the end of turn. So that skill is actually pretty good because sometimes you just need things to spend your Counterblast on. You need to get to 0 face-up damage. And it is until the end of turn, so usually what you'll do is you'll boost, you'll give 5k to the thing in front of it. It combos really well with the Mermaid we just talked about earlier, the grade 3, because they can pump each other up by 5k, and that's basically 10k to the whole column. Unfortunately, it's not a super magic number, but sometimes you need to do it. But the main skill is the second one, where at the end of the battle it boosts. If you have a Vanguard with powerful ability, which you're always going to have in this deck, you actually get to stand this unit. It's actually not optional, but you have to stay on this unit. And then you choose a card from your soul and you put it into the drop. So this card is your main booster because you want to always be putting this behind whatever you're going to be restanding with Hermina's skill. Because every single time this card boosts, it's going to restand itself, which means it can boost once again. Which is why it combos really well with the Mermaid, because you swing, Counterblast 1, 5k here, Counterblast 1, 5k here. That's a 21, 31 column. At the end of the battle, this restands itself, and then you swing Hermina, restand the grade 3, and then you swing again, and then you can actually use this skill without this skill. Probably you'd want to use because you want the on hit without paying the counterblast because it's reduced by 1. So you would use this skill. This is 31, 36 now, which is granted not a super great number, but it is much better than you would get if you were just boosting, or if you boosted with a normal card and you just restood it and swung without a boost. So this card just really carries the deck on its back. It's just super important to have But despite that, I do like calling it out early game to start doing some aggro, because this deck is very aggro. You kind of have to push early game in order to make sure that you can actually finish the game in the mid to late game. Alright, so moving on, we have another new card from LBT-03, which is the 4 copies of Musetta. So let's start by going over her skill. So she is, when she boosts a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Hermina in its card name, which means you have to be on grade 3, but not necessarily your opponent. If you have no cards, if you're powerful, all your front row units get plus 2k until the end of turn. So you might think that's not really a great skill, but it does actually matter a lot more than you would expect. And then actually at the end of that battle, you can put her to the bottom of the deck, and then you actually get a counter charge 1. So that counter charge 1 actually just like makes your turn so much more explosive, because it means you can do so much more. And this is also the card that I was talking about, which makes your drive check user actually usable. Alright, so just finishing up with our grade 1s, I do actually play 1 copy of the ride deck card. This is mostly just because I would like some extra boosters, but it is just an 8k booster, which is not great at most of the time. It works well with the 15k attacker, but mostly I'm just playing this card because you really need to empty out that soul. So this card is just in there to be another card that you can draw into in order to empty out your soul if you really need it, because emptying out that soul is just very important. Otherwise you're not doing anything, because if you don't have an empty soul, you're not powerful. Right, and the true final grade 1 is just the 4 copies of the PG. I should be playing the Cray Elemental Sentinel Perfect Guard, but I'm not because I don't have any extras. Totally, if you want to play this deck competitively, you definitely just would take one of these PGs out and play the order. But I don't want to really bother with that right now, and it doesn't really come up too much for me, does it? Yeah. Right, so moving on to the trigger lineup, we start off with the only expensive card in the deck, which is the effect draws. I think that having the extra draw is pretty important in this deck, just because you're pretty combo based and you do need a lot of pieces. And also the draw really helps because you're discarding a lot of cards, especially in the early game. You're cycling, and you just really need a lot of cards in your hand. I would recommend, if you do really want to play the deck, or if you want to you might as well just pick these up. I know they're kind of expensive, but this, as I said, this is the only expensive card in the deck, and if you ever want to play any lyrical, it's good to have these, so you might as well pick them up. And I mean, the rest of the deck is probably like $10 other than this card. So if you like Hermina and you're a little worried about the price point of the check triggers, just buy these ones. That's pretty much the only card you'll need in the deck. Alright, so next up, since we are playing the 4 draw triggers, we are actually playing just 7 crit. So you might wonder, oh, why aren't you playing the effect crit? Well, if you remember how the powerful ability works, it means that you can't have any cards in soul, which is negative synergy with that critical trigger. So another reason why this deck is budget is because I think that you really don't need any effect triggers other than the draw triggers. You could play fronts in this deck, but as I said, I think you need the pieces a little bit more. So if you just buy the draws, everything else in this deck is just like 20 cents. So you can, like I said, you can probably pick this deck up for like $10. Right, and so just finishing off the trigger lineup, we have the 1 OT. Pretty good. Actually goes off a little bit more than you would expect, just because you do have 4 drive checks for some of your turns. And of course, we do have the 4 heals. Alright, so moving on, I think I'd like to go over some of the combos that you can actually do with this deck. So the first one is a pretty basic combo using your Signy and your Turres. So if you have 2 face-up damage, this combo works regardless of how much damage you have, so it's pretty decent. So you would just like swing with this, that's hitting 21. Depending on how much face-up damage you have, you would either use this skill or this. You would use this skill or both skills. In this case, we're pretending we have 2 damage, so we'd counterblast 2. This skill gives 5k here, this skill gives 5k here. She gets the on hit, so that's now swinging for 31, which is a pretty decent number if you're going first. At the end of the battle, Signy's going to restand herself, and then we are going to swing with the Vanguard. do some random drive checks. Drive 1, drive 2, and then we would, at the end of the battle, we discard a card, restand this. The next time we would pay for a counterblast, it is going to be free, so we would swing 21 skill of this to pump this up by another 5k. That is now swinging for 36. So if you were listening to those numbers, you would know that they are not actually great numbers, which is where our booster actually does come in pretty well, because she gives the front row an extra 2k. So that's not only just important for Vanguard swing, because this would be a 21k column, giving your front row 2k. That makes her a 23 instead of a 21, which is a much better number. It also works for your helps out your grade 3s so that they hit 15. So whether they're being boosted by 8k, that's 23, and it scales better so that your second swing would be 38 instead of 36. So another basic play you could do with the deck is just using Nala as your main attacker. So you would just like call her. Let's say you have something in your soul. It's your first grade 3 turn. You counterblast 1, call out your soul. Now you emptied it out. You would swing boost. This is hitting 18. If your opponent's Vanguard is at grade 3, which for this case we're going to pretend, she gets the extra 5k, so it's now 23, which is a very nice number. You would use the skill of Signy to counterblast 1, your last counterblast, give Nala 5k, so now it's 28, which is a super good magic number. At the end of the battle, Signy will stand herself, then you would swing with the Hermina, get your drive checks, discard, restand the Nala, and now you can use Signy's skill without counterblasting, and Nala is going to gain 5k again because she swings. So she's pumping herself up by another 2, so she is at 20, plus the 5, add another one, another 5k, that is 30, 38, which is a super good number. Alright, and so for our last play, it's going to be honestly the most insane play that this deck can really do, using the 2 new cards from LBT-03. So in order to do this play to its maximum potential, you are going to need 2 face-up damage. You can actually do this with just 1 damage, but it's going to be a little bit less than maximum. So you basically just call out your 2 rears. If you have anything in soul, use Soul Blast for her so that you can get into powerful state. Your Vanguard plus 5k, which is nice magic numbers, 18 or 23 in this case, because she's going to give an extra 2k to the front row. So what you would do is you would swing, boost Signy, using her skill, you counterblast 2, she gets an extra 10k, and she performs drive checks. So this is 18, 28. You drive check 1, at the end of the battle, Signy stands herself, and then you would swing with the Vanguard. So you swing Vanguard. If you use this skill, it's going to be either 28 or just 23. And then you do actually need to time this right, because Hermina has to have no face-up damage to activate her skill. So you would activate Hermina's skill first, discarding a card, restanding this rearguard. Then you would proc Musetta's skill. You put her to the bottom of the deck and countercharge 1. So now you can use the next skill that you use is reduced by counterblast 1. So remember that she costs counterblast 2, but since we're reducing it by 1, it's only counterblast 1 now. So you would counterblast 1, get another 10k, so this is 18, 28, 38 with a drive check. And you already drive check 2, so that's 4 drive checks in a single turn for 2 counterblast. You can actually do this with 1 counterblast if you have the grade 1. In that case, you would just boost. You probably use the skill of Signy to counterblast 1, give 5k here. So that's hitting for 23. Not as good of a number, but it's alright. And then you can swing. Signy's actually going to be standing. Swing for 23, restand, countercharge, put this to the bottom, and then you would swing, counterblast 1, 10k, and you get your drive check. Alright, so I figured we'd end the deck profile with just a quick test hand, because your starting hand is actually a little bit important and a little bit different than some of the other decks. So let's go ahead and start off with the 5 cards. Alright, so we have the Signy, which is a super important combo piece, and we really need it. We don't want OT, we want OT in deck. We don't need an attacker yet. This isn't going to be live for a while. We could keep this, But I think what's really important that we need to have in our hand is we need a way to empty out our soul when we get to grade 2. So I'm actually going to put this one back and mull 4 in order to try and get a card that can take a card out of the soul. So now Signy can actually do that in a pinch, but the thing is you would have to call it. You'd have to call something else that it can boost, because when it restand, it empties out your soul for you. And sometimes you don't want to be calling her out because you don't want her to get retired, so that because she's a really good piece. All right, so our top 4, we unfortunately didn't draw into anything. We did get a grade 2, which means we can use Signy at least to empty out the soul that way. But we're really hurting for cards right now. So what we would do is, let's go ahead and say we go first. We draw for turn. When you're riding into your grade 1, what you need to do is you need to decide what 2 cards in your hand you want to discard. So you need to discard 1 for ride deck and 1 for the grade 1. So in this case, the grade 3 isn't doing anything. I'm still on grade 1. It's going to take too long. And I do have 2 triggers, so I think I'm going to be discarding one of the triggers. So it doesn't matter what order you do it in. You can discard either or. So you would discard 1 of them per ride deck, and then Soul Blast 1. Discard the other one you want to discard, and you draw a card. So we drew into another one, so wow. So we would take a damage because we kind of need it. Draw a card. So once again, we didn't get any way to empty out our soul, so we are hurting a little bit. We would use a ride deck skill to ride without discarding. In this case, we are desperate for cards. So what we would have to do is ways to get our soul empty. We'd have to call the Signy. We'd have to call the Agrea. We would have to boost for 18, and then Signy Skull procs at the end since she's boosting a powerful. I have to put a card from Soul into drop and restand herself. And then you just swing Van, drive check, nothing. I really wish we would have had this card earlier because we could have just counterblasted 1 and called it out. So let's say we take another damage, critical trigger. Ooh. Makes it so much easier to guard. And they swing with the Van. We no pass it. And then we restand for our turn. Draw for turn. And since we have no cards in Soul, we get a ride for free. So, yeah, I probably should have intercepted with that last turn. What we do here is probably, I have 2 face-up counterblast and I need to use them. I can use 1 counterblast for Signy. And if I were to call a Nala, I can call her over, use 1 of my counterblasts, call out my grade 2 from the ride deck, and now I have a full front row. Swing with the Signy, use my last counterblast to pump Nala up. Signy will stand at the end of the battle. Swing with Hermina, drive checks, ooh, Persona Ride, Signy, cool. Restand the Nala by discarding maybe another Signy, because you really only need 1, unless it gets retired. And then swing again, use Signy skill, pump up the other rear guard, swing 17. Alright, so that's going to do it for my Hermina deck profile. I hope you enjoyed. Like I said, this deck is not super competitive, but it is pretty fun to use, and it can definitely steal a couple games because it just can hit really insane numbers. Alright, so I'll see you on the next one.